Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you happenstance into this truth bomb riff, my name is Patrick Lovell. I am the producer with the $71 trillion truth. I think sometimes that opening gets lost on people because they have no idea that that is the answer that the entire world is looking for. In addition to that, how many people actually truly understand what the number $71 trillion means? Not many. This is my 751st episode of these Truth Bomb Riffs, which I've mentioned on so many occasions as part lecture, part sermon, part self help therapy, as I try to unwind the information I have as a producer who's been on a many year journey to discover this incredible information that I have to record this morning to be able to try to cut through the madness, cut through the noise of everything that you're engaged in, and hopefully you can tune in, turn up the volume, find a way to get through. However, my voice is scratchy at the moment, and I apologize for that. Hopefully, it'll work itself out while I'm talking. And then also, those of you who watch these all the time, you might be looking at my left eye and going, "Hey, that looks bloodshot." Yeah, I had an emergency. I had an accident on Friday, car accident, and ended up going to the emergency room. For those of you who are waiting for the new Untouchables episode on Friday afternoon, and we're going to record later this afternoon. But I wasn't planning on recording this morning because still a little bit kind of worried about the look. But at the same time, this information is so important that I decided I'm going to go for it. I don't care exactly what it takes to be able to get you this information, but I have to somehow do it because it's extraordinary. And I guess on further note, I'm just going to share my screen and just try to jump right into it. But I guess I should provide kind of an opening first and foremost. So to kind of set the table, obviously we're all amidst the Epstein file release, and then of course Rokana had coined the term the Epstein Class, which got a lot of, shall we say, reaction to the magnitude of the revelations of all of the different players over the course of literally decades that are involved in a number of different scenarios that just paint this picture of this nefarious, almost evil cabal of international, let's just say, powerful players that were involved in this mechanism that seemed to have its network and ties really in everything, right? And a lot of people are framing this, particularly in the podcast space. Those that are influencers, those that have very large audiences, much larger than mine. And by the way, thank you to all of you that have been involved with this from the beginning. And then also thank you to the growing numbers that I'm discovering on Blue Sky. Something happened in the last couple of days where it just seems like I'm suddenly being followed, inundated with real people, particularly real people that are all manner, shape, or form the anti Epstein class, as it were. And they are discovering me. And not a moment too soon because I've been doing this for years. And, but the information I have now is fully unbelievable, apparent, and clear to me at a level that it's never been before. And I'm going to demonstrate it here. And I can't believe my voice is scratchy as it is. I have no idea. So I'm going to try to pause momentarily and clear my throat. I may have to do that frequently as I go through this, so my apologies. But okay, so I mean, it's unbelievable. I want to find just the perfect words to be able to set this moment up, but it's just like I find myself incredibly tweaked. But I guess I'll save my voice for a minute, and I'm going to share some things that are very interesting, and I'll pop in some commentary to try to connect all of the dots here. But what's really got me going this morning is, and I was a few days late to this, but because we were all inundated with what took place on the floor of the House and the Transparency Act with, Rokana and all of the Democrats, and of course, all things Pam Bondi last weekend. I should say last week. I think it was last Thursday. But this came on my radar last week, and it slipped through my fingers. But it's the glue that brings together everything that I've been talking about for a long time. I'm going to try to slow it down, hopefully, so that it doesn't feel like a tidal wave of information. But please bear with me. This is the answers the entire country has to wrap its mind around. Yeah.
Files has now reached one of the largest investment banks in the world, Goldman Sachs. The bank's chief legal officer, Kathy Rumler, now says she is resigning. In recent weeks, she has weathered numerous stories examining her relationship with Epstein over the years. Rumler is a former White House counsel to President Obama. She and those around her have insisted that her relationship with Epstein, it was a professional relationship through and through and ended. A spokesperson for Rumler declined to answer some of the detailed questions sent to them from CNN, but said that Rumler said this, has done nothing wrong, has nothing to hide, nothing in the record suggests otherwise, adding that Rumler has been clear and consistent from the outset. She knew him through her work as a criminal defense attorney, shared a client with him, received referrals from him, and was friendly in that professional context. After her announcement, her resignation announcement, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, David Solomon, told CNN this. Throughout her tenure, Kathy has been an extraordinary general counsel, and we are grateful for her contributions. He went on to
for a proposed trip to Epstein's island and gifts he'd given her. Rumler has repeatedly said she regrets ever knowing Epstein and that she had, quote, no knowledge of any new or ongoing unlawful activity on his part. That's her quote. Out front now, K-File's Andrew Kaczynski, who has been breaking all of this reporting. So
Before I move on, I want to just point out that Aaron Burnett, the anchor here at CNN, was a former employee of Goldman Sachs, and I'd actually witnessed several years ago during another fraud investigation that didn't happen to involve Goldman Sachs. But Aaron went directly to Lloyd Blankfein for directions on how to identify fraud, which was telling considering what I'm going to tell you, all things considered. But let's let this speak for itself.
Oh, Andrew, what have you found?
Well, Aaron, after his 2008 conviction, other communications between the two include plans for a proposed trip to Epstein's island and responses to gifts he'd given Rumler. And since she wrote, quote, totally tricked out by Uncle Jeffrey today. Jeffrey boots, handbag, and watch. Now, in some of these back and forth messages, Rumler discussed personal matters in her life. She expressed gratitude for their, quote, friendship, sometimes concluded her messages to Epstein with the sign off XO and XOXO. There's one example we found where Rumler sent Epstein a message on his 62nd birthday in 2015 to wish him well, writing, I hope you enjoy the day with your one true love, adding a smiley face. Epstein replied with a raunchy note and an apparent reference to masturbation, writing, they say men usually give a name to their penis as it would be inappropriate to make love to a total stranger. Now, after receiving Epstein's racy reply, Rumler responded, hard to believe there is still an open question about whether men are the inferior gender.
Okay. So what has Rumler said about this message?
Well, Aaron, we asked them about that, and they referred this exchange. Rumler and her communications team referred CNN's questions about this to her attorney, Tom Clare, and this is what he told us. He said, quote, the fact is Ms. Rumler does not make any statement about Epstein's penis. She does not reference it. She does not joke about it. She does not banter with Epstein about it. She does not accede to Epstein's unsolicited, gratuitous remarks about men and their penises, nothing. Her participation in the entire exchange I think he meant is limited to wishing Epstein a happy birthday, ridiculing Epstein for the remark, and exiting the exchange.
Okay, so the files also reveal new details about how Rumler advised Epstein regarding some of his legal and reputational problems.
Okay, before I go on with this, I first of all I apologize. I put myself on mute to clear my throat, and I think that may have cut off some of the dialogue of these particular reporters in the exchange as well. But I want to point out a couple of other things here. What I found interesting when I was listening to this for the first time, and please know my filter is that I really hate CNN for a lot of reasons. I've always disliked CNN, as I pointed out, Aaron Burnett, just like her colleague, I'm going to say over at MS Now, who came from Deutsche Bank. I always found it amazing. Let's get smarter with, and it's the dumbest show ever. She follows Lawrence O'Donnell. I can't even think of her name right now because she's so stupid, quite frankly. But both of these women didn't have backgrounds in journalism. They came out of huge financial institutions into mainstream media, which is very telling, okay, first and foremost. But second of all, the thing that you've got to understand, because this might sound salacious, Epstein talking about his penis and, a nickname and some of these absurdities and everything else. He's talking to the general counsel of Goldman Sachs. Okay. That's who this Kathy Rumler is. Not only that, she was an advisor. She came out of the Justice Department. She worked on the Enron case, and then she ended up in Obama's administration. She was being considered for the Attorney General of the United States. She's young, by the way. I think now she's 51. And as it turns out, she's had this incredible relationship with Epstein, as we'll demonstrate here. But if you have any idea who the great vampire squid is and what the vampire squid has been involved with for the past at least 15 years that we're aware of, which I'll demonstrate in a little bit, it's extraordinary, particularly because Kathy Rumler was, I believe in her bio, it said in charge of Goldman Sachs's white collar fraud division defense counsel. Of course, she would be general counsel. Again, to emphasize, if I haven't already said it, because I'm a little bit distracted because of my voice, that's the top attorney for one of the largest investment banks in the world that has been up to its eyeballs in fraud for over several decades now. Okay? And being a young person to get to that level and to have a relationship with Epstein on the level that these folks are demonstrating is quite extraordinary. I'll continue.
So what more can you tell us about that tonight?
Well, yeah, that's right, Aaron. In one exchange from February 2015, Rumler addressed a Crimes Victims' Rights Act lawsuit brought by Epstein's accusers. That's the lawsuit which sought to reopen his so-called sweetheart plea deal from 2008. Rumler wrote to Epstein, "I told you that the CVRA case is about money." And in another message after inquiring about which lawyer was handling the case, Rumler wrote, "Victims' rights, my ass." In another message from July 2015, Rumler forwarded Epstein a New York Times story which featured critics of sex offender registries like the one Epstein had been listed on for years by then. Did you see the New York Times story, Ray? Misapplication of sex offender registry. Thinking about whether there is an opportunity there, Rumler wrote. Now,
the general counsel of Goldman Sachs is providing legal advice and saying things as really despicable, all things considered, as victims' rights, my ass, and then thinking about whether there is an opportunity here. We frequently hear about tall building law firms and $1,000 an hour. First of all, Jeffrey Epstein wasn't her client, and she'd be far, far north of $1,000 per hour. And that might tie into a lot of the information that I have, but we'll get there.
Spokesperson for Rumler told CNN in a statement that Epstein, quote, sought informal advice and she provided feedback based on her understanding at the time without any formal involvement.
Okay. Well, you also found emails that show Rumler responding to an invitation from Epstein to visit that infamous private Caribbean island, right?
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. According to the newly released files, Rumler at one point inquired about taking a, quote, day trip to Epstein's private island. In a January 16, 2017 email that you can see right here, Epstein asked if he could have a plane pick her up in St. Lucia to fly her to, quote, the island. Rumler replied asking, can we take a day trip to the island on Saturday, or is it too far? Emails then show a week later Epstein appearing to coordinate a private jet to pick her up and referencing a copy of Rumler's passport. This trip appears to have fallen through, though, with Rumler writing 2 days later there was, quote, still too much risk in the air. Later that year, a topic of the island actually came up again in messages between the two. After Hurricane Irma damaged the island, Rumler mused about traveling there to help Epstein clean up, writing, you know how much I like physical labor. It's unclear whether Rumler ever visited the island, and she has denied ever going there.
By the way, I don't know if you happen to catch it, but she said she was off the grid with tobacco farmers. I don't know if you happen to catch my truth bomb riff with David Sirota when he laid out to the new untouchables all manner, shape, or form of the Powell memo, and of course, Chief Justice Powell came out of the tobacco industry. You can't make this shit up.
Okay, so what is she saying about these emails then?
So, Aaron, Jennifer Connelly, Rumler's spokesperson, declined to answer some of the detailed questions from CNN, but she told us this, quote, Miss Rumler has done nothing wrong and has nothing to hide. Nothing in the record suggests otherwise. Jeffrey Epstein was a man of 1,000 faces. Miss Rumler only saw the one he put on to win people over and gain credibility and acceptance. Her views were shaped by that and his denials of any wrongdoing other than what he had pled guilty to years prior. Miss Rumler has been clear and consistent from the outset. She knew him through her work as a criminal defense attorney, shared a client with him, received referrals from him, and was friendly in that professional context. At times, Epstein sought informal advice, and she provided feedback based on her understanding at the time without any formal involvement. Miss Rumler has deep sympathy for those harmed by Epstein, and if she knew then what she knows now, she never would have dealt with him.
Let's remember her statement in an email, victims' rights, my ass. And but notice how CNN can only talk to her handlers, right? Because she is somebody of great significance of the largest investment bank, one of the largest investment banks on the planet, more political influence than I think any other entity on the planet, quite frankly. And she is deeply connected in advising Epstein. And this will lead to everything that I'm revealing to you. But an interesting note here as well. Again, I hate CNN. I hate Time Warner. I hate all things Barry Weiss. I detest all things what's going on here with Larry Ellison. But I do find it interesting that maybe they're allowing this information to be seen. Why? Might it be who, in addition to Goldman Sachs, that Miss Rumler worked for? We'll get to that.
Aaron.
All right, Andrew Kaczynski from KFILE with more incredible reporting on the story. Thank you.
Joining me right now is Gretchen Carlson, the co-founder of Lift Our Voices nonprofit that works to end mechanisms that prevent survivors of sexual assault and harassment from being able to speak out publicly, has been a very important voice in this conversation through and through. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you.
So you see this, Kathy Rumler announcing this resignation. This is really the first real fallout, I think we could say, or consequence that has happened in the United States from the release of the Jeffrey Epstein files. What do you make of that?
What it says to me is that this is all about power, right? And that it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman or a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. Power usurps all of that. And especially when you're involved in this level of power. I don't think we should be surprised to see women who are on the Democratic side or otherwise, being the people that are going to fall down from this. Now, whether or not she did anything illegal is not what the question here is. The question is that she continued an association with a known child sex trafficker, and she received gifts in return. And, so this is very questionable that somebody should be as high up as she is at Goldman Sachs. It's a huge question of judgment.
That same question goes to so many more people now, right? That is coming out in these files. This is the...
Yeah, a question of judgment. Would a woman who's at the apex of the largest, most influential giant vampire squid on the planet be a question of judgment or a reflection of how things work?
first and only so far person to face consequences, and not one of the people, though, that is listed in FBI document as a co-conspirator of Epstein's, right? This is that whole thing that Tom Massey and Ro Khanna, they went in, they read through the files, they said they found 6 names that were redacted, that were listed by the FBI as co-conspirators. They went to the floor, they read the names, then they're unredacted. Overseas, and nothing from that. Overseas, you have a prince and ambassadors, senior diplomats, top politicians, all brought down by the Epstein files. All in Europe, not in the United States. I don't know what to do with this.
Well, I think
if I'm a female correspondent who lives in an ivory tower and who doesn't understand the information that I'm providing for you, it's pretty easy to understand how she might identify that Miss Rumler is a woman and obviously targeted because of that. All of the men in the club get to stay in power while the only woman who may have had some sort of, I don't know, strange relationship with Jeffrey Epstein would be targeted. But she's just yet another example of not being able to see the forest for the trees because they're not telling you the information that I am. So another reason why you can't trust mainstream media, even though I am so glad I discovered this from CNN, given everything I've already laid out.
it's completely contingent on this administration. I mean, they have been the ones that have called it a hoax. They have been the ones that have not, had any sort of admiration for the survivors and the kind of bravery that it's taken for them to come forward. And you had Pam Bondi giving one of the most despicable performances 2 days ago in front of that House committee, and not even acknowledging the survivors that were standing behind her. That photo is going to go down in infamy with her back to them. So I think if we had a different administration that really wanted to get to the bottom of this, and I should also mention that they never got to the bottom of it in the Biden administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration.
5 administrations,
but
right?
I think
I liked how she slipped that in because that's where my mind was going when I originally heard that. It's really all about Bondi, right? Bondi and this just train wreck of just transparency of corruption and cover up. But and I'll get to who Pam Bondi is downstream, and I've laid that out in many of my truth bomb riffs. But yeah, it's all of the administrations, my friends, and yeah. Just look at how these incredibly clever people can insert information and cherry pick and do this, that, and the other to make a point that they need to make because they're high priced people of communication, and yet none of them have any inclination of the information that I have. Or if they do, they're obviously paid to cover it up, which would actually be in synchronicity with everything else that's going on.
now, we've seen such a change in tenor because the survivors are being believed. This movement continues. It's different than those other administrations. And for the last year, there's been nothing.
It's different because finally people on both sides of the aisle are finding it politically expedient to give voice to voices that they suppressed over a decade ago and then also paid to go away. It's 2026. This stuff happened over 2 decades ago. Is it relevant? Well, because they're telling us it's relevant, but of course it's relevant because unfortunately, this is the tip of the iceberg, and that's what I have to try to get through to demonstrate.
Nothing but an apparent cover-up to not get to the bottom. Let's not forget also that Ghislaine Maxwell said in a court document in January that she knew of 25 co-conspirators. And then she came before the House committee and pled the 5th this week and said, I'm not going to tell you who any of them are unless you give me clemency.
Yeah.
So the President of the United States today should say that he's not giving her clemency and that he is not going to pardon her so that she can no longer use that chip.
The president should not give Ghislaine Maxwell clemency. We're talking about Donald Trump. All right, next video.
Rumler is resigning after thousands of newly released emails and documents show that she had a much closer relationship with convicted sex offender and disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein than she had previously ever let on. Rumler has had a pretty big resume. She was a federal prosecutor who helped convict Enron executives. She was President Obama's White House counsel and was briefly even considered to be Attorney General. She joined Goldman Sachs in 2020 and became the bank's general counsel, their top lawyer, a year later. But for years, Rumler has downplayed her ties to Epstein. She calls him a monster and says that she regretted ever knowing him and has called it a strictly professional lawyer-client relationship. But 8,400 documents released tell a different story. The emails show personal exchanges, dinner plans, jokes, conversations about their dating lives. She calls him Uncle Jeffrey in one email, and in another she wrote, "I adore him. It's like having an older brother." Epstein also showered her with expensive gifts, Hermes handbags, a Fendi fur coat, spa treatments. And this was years after Epstein was convicted on sex crimes charges in 2008. As Epstein became aware that he might be indicted on new charges in 2019, some of the documents show that Rumler helped Epstein craft strategies on how he could defend his public image. The emails became too much for Rumler, and she resigned. Goldman Sachs' CEO, David Solomon, said he accepted her resignation and praised her work, and she will stay on with the firm until the middle of this year.
Yeah, talking about conflicts of interest. I still can't get over that she's general counsel of Goldman Sachs, and she was named that in 2020 after coming out of the Obama administration and after, actually being a prosecutor in the Enron era, which I'm going to bring up in my new Untouchables podcast this afternoon because of proximity to someone who I know personally. But what was happening in 2020? Among other things, the IMDb scandal, which actually ironically ties this Malaysian massive fraud and Ponzi scheme that Goldman was directing and involved with, that among other things went to finance one of my favorite movies starring Leonardo DiCaprio called The Wolf of Wall Street, the story about Jordan Belfort, which I just watched recently, which really is kind of a confluence of all of this other stuff. So I encourage you to watch it on Netflix while it still lasts. It says it's leaving soon. But so here we go with the next piece of information that we should respond to.
Obama White House counsel Kathy Rumler. Happy birthday. I hope you enjoy the day with your one true love.
Obama White House counsel.
Adding a smiley face. Epstein responded, "They say that men usually gave a name to their penis, as it would be inappropriate to make love to a total stranger." Rumler replied, "Hard to believe that there is still an open question about whether men are the inferior gender." This is one of just a few of the hundreds of emails that Rumler exchanged with Epstein during the final years of his life. Now the chief legal officer at Goldman Sachs, Rumler has said that she got to know Epstein through her work as a lawyer, and that the two were, quote, friendly in that professional context. But in the latest release of Epstein files from the Justice Department, photos of Rumler and messages between the two suggest they had a close personal friendship. Rumler discussed matters in her personal life, expressed gratitude for their, quote, friendship, sometimes concluded messages with, quote, XO and XOXO, and repeatedly fawned over gifts from who she called at times Uncle Jeffrey. Rumler even discussed possibly visiting Epstein's private island, asking in 2017 if she could take a, quote, day trip there, with emails suggesting Epstein tried to coordinate a private jet to pick her up. It's unclear if the visit ever occurred, and a Goldman Sachs spokesperson previously said Rumler never visited the island. Rumler's PR team referred CNN's questions about her birthday exchange with Epstein to her attorney. The fact is, Miss Rumler does not make any statement about Epstein's penis. She does not reference it. She does not joke about it. She does not banter with Epstein about it. She does not accede to Epstein's unsolicited, gratuitous remarks about men and their penises. Nothing. In another message from...
Right, she doesn't engage it, but she accepts all of his gifts and is going to go to his island.
July 2015, Rumler asked Epstein if he read a New York Times story which featured critics of sex offender registries, like the one he had been listed on for several years by then. Thinking about whether there is an opportunity there, Rumler wrote. Asked about that exchange, a Rumler spokesperson told CNN, at times Epstein sought informal advice and she provided feedback based upon her understanding at the time, without any formal involvement. Months later, Rumler wrote that helping Epstein with his, quote, legal was important because, quote, friendships goes two ways.
What?
Spokesperson for Rumler told CNN she, quote, has done nothing wrong and has nothing to hide. Nothing in the records suggests otherwise.
Except that she was accepting gifts from Epstein and going to the island and providing legal advice for what?
Jeffrey Epstein was a man of 1,000 faces. Miss Rumler only saw the one he put on to win people over and gain credibility and acceptance. Her views were shaped by that, and his denials of any wrongdoing other than what he had pled guilty to years prior. Miss Rumler has deep sympathy for those harmed by Epstein. If she knew then what she knows now, she never would have dealt with him at all.
Yeah, she has deep sympathy, but what did she say previously? I'm sure you could write it in the comment section. Yeah, victim writes my ass. It's not funny, but it's unbelievable.
This woman, who later became the top lawyer at Goldman Sachs the night he was arrested in 2019. Before that, he had showered her with gifts, and she even described him as an older brother. That's why I'm surprised her departure from Goldman took this long. Right up until Catherine Rumler sent in her resignation, the firm was still defending its top attorney. Goldman maintained that her interactions with Epstein were typical of a business relationship and that the convicted sex offender gave unsolicited gifts to many of his contacts. Rumler says that she had only a professional relationship with Epstein, had no knowledge of his criminal conduct, and regretted ever knowing him. But the connection between them has been publicly known since at least 2023, when the Wall Street Journal outed her as someone who appeared on Epstein's private calendar. The two also exchanged more than 11,000 emails between 2014 and 2019 when she was serving as a criminal defense attorney. Yet as each new batch of Epstein files revealed more about the scope and nature of the relationship, Goldman's defense of Rumler grew more confusing. Just last month, a spokesperson called their interactions inconsequential friendly exchanges. But Bloomberg News had noted how the warm tone of Epstein's emails with her stood out. After the latest batch of files were released, there were signs that Goldman was distancing itself from its top lawyer. Even then, however, the decision to leave was reportedly still Rumler's. By characterizing their relationship as strictly professional, Goldman sent the wrong message about what companies should consider appropriate behavior. And that's especially true for Rumler, because it's hard to see how her reputation and judgment wouldn't have everything to do with her job at Goldman.
Okay, but again, she's the top lawyer in charge of the white-collar fraud division of Goldman Sachs, who was up to its eyeballs being the global vampire squid that was deeply immersed with what I'm going to reveal to you, and the 2008 great financial crisis that, oh yeah, happened to be tied directly to Bear Stearns, which happened to be, oh my God, connected directly to Jeffrey Epstein, which we'll go into. But my God, it's like all of these people, because we give you this like tight bandwidth, and there's things you got to be careful with attorneys and what you can say publicly and being sued and all of these other things. And you notice that again, Kathy Rumler's spokespeople and probably 10 deep in consultants and attorneys that are getting more than $1,000 an hour to basically lie to your face and say she did nothing inappropriate, when we see the emails that she was accepting unbelievable gifts from this clown, at the same time providing legal advice and potentially going to his island. And yet, the woman from CNN's, it's like, yeah, maybe it's just because she's a woman. Oh my God, they're all in on it. And again, to remind you, Aaron Burnett worked at Goldman Sachs, and of course, the only reason I can conceive that Barry Weiss at Time Warner may have approved this sort of initiative is because Rumler was on the legal staff of Barack Obama. Oh my God! And continuing.
30th, and in a statement, Remler said in part, "My responsibility is to put Goldman Sachs' interest first." The company's CEO said, "She will be missed. I accepted her resignation, and I respect her decision."
If this had been a conservative, the first two words would have been Trump lawyer quits.
Sure, 1,000%.
That would have been the first two words.
For sure. But this is her current role right now, right? That's why they're.
By the way, the only reason I'm showing this is because, look, this has popped up on my radar, this podcast before. I think these guys are a bunch of Trump bootlicking idiots, and I can't listen really or give any credibility. But this happened to pop up because I'm searching Kathy Rumler, and these guys say some pretty funny things, all things considered. But please don't interpret this as me giving credence to these guys, other than they happen to be at least say I think some clever and yet on point things here. And I hate to give guys that I hate ideologically any sort of credibility, but yeah, I'll let it speak for itself.
It doesn't matter, Adam.
She got a high end Hermes bag for $93.50. She got multiple bottles of wine, boots, a watch, and other clothing items. In one email, she wrote she was totally tricked out. Jeffrey's boots, handbag and watch, a Hermes Apple Watch band. She discussed which style she wanted in a 2018 email, and some reports suggest luxury coats and additional accessories like designer fur, trims, and other possible other gifts. There you go.
When did Epstein suicide himself?
I want to know why. Why was he so close to her that he felt he had to swag her up like that? Why? That's what I want to know. What was she doing for him? What work was she doing? He decided, man, I gotta send swag. I just gotta light up her lobby with her assistant dropping all this stuff in.
You're lacking, are you discounting her ability to be a lawyer and practice law?
No. I want to know, what was she working on? What projects was she working on?
Well, she exchanged 11,300 emails from 2014 to 2019.
With Epstein?
With Epstein.
14 to 19? Yeah. 11,000?
11,300.
Was she working with Obama at the time?
Kathy Obama.
14 she was.
From 2014 to 2019. That's one direct message on 70% of the days. And then banking billionaire Ariane de Rothschild sent or received 5,500 emails, while former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers exchanged 4,300 emails.
Okay, so Rumler has 11,000 emails exchanged with with Epstein between 2014 and 2019, and 2 of those years she's working with Obama. Okay. Now, I wanted to show this because, look, I thought I got a sense of the Epstein victims for some time, and I'm like grossed out, I guess, by the whole thing. But at the same time, I've been around the block. I've seen a lot of crazy things and how people can make Faustian bargains, especially if they come from, circumstances where, they can be leveraged, quite frankly, by opportunities that they might not otherwise have. And, I kind of take everything in terms of the input, to try to think about this entirety of this situation. But as I've said previously, and I think a lot of other people are tracking on, it is absolutely grotesque, the predation model of these powerful people that were predating on girls, literally, and the beauty pageant and all of the other kind of sick behavior that Trump was involved with, and which is being revealed in it. And as a sidebar, by the way, I used to produce a television show called Home Team. And I did that with my colleague, Eric Vaughn, who became my partner on this journey forever. And our host of that program was a guy by the name of Troy McClain. And Troy McClain was on the premiere season of The Apprentice, and he was the finalist up against Omarosa, and he was kind of well known at that time. And he was actually buddy with Trump. And I became good buddies with him. And one time I was in New York, I think I was there 2011-ish, and I was taking a bunch of meetings, crazy time period. And Troy was there, and Troy literally was there to attend a beauty pageant with Trump, and he had invited me, and I had a meeting with the NFL, believe it or not, and I didn't go. But so I've looked through this lens of and I worked in Hollywood, and I've seen all sorts of crazy things in my life. I used to work for some of the biggest executive producers that you might call Weinstein-like, quite frankly. They were pretty much right up there with them in a lot of strange ways. So I've been around the block. I've seen some crazy things, and I've been in the zeitgeist of all of this stuff, but for decades. But it wasn't until I saw Anuska DeGorgio, give this incredible interview yesterday on the Midas Touch with Ben Marcellus. And quite frankly, I don't really think he's a genuine actor, to be honest with you, completely. He's an attorney like them all, and they can all spend what they need to. But I bought what she was talking about, because what she reveals was they literally were trapped, enslaved, basically drugged, put into this situation where they were at call, beck and call for these gross scenarios. And they were literally just thrown into sexual slavery. Now, this person didn't come from the, let's say, a background where, she was, didn't have a lot of resources. I think she came from a pretty upper middle class family, but she just wanted to be in the zeitgeist, and she, wanted to model and all of these other things. But she was also taken in and turned into an addict, and then completely, thrown into sexual slavery. And what she has to say is just absolutely amazing. And she has a lot of information. But this is what I wanted to show you at the beginning of this interview, because I think this sets up what it is that I'm going to get to.
Very people who are meant to lead this country, who are meant to protect the innocent and the vulnerable and stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, have completely re-traumatized us. It's like being raped by the Department of Justice.
It's like being raped by the Department of Justice. Hold that thought. So last week, in addition to everything else, we had the fireworks of this circus of insanity that took place, in the House because of the Transparency Act. And, I'll just let this speak for itself, and then I'll take us to the next level.
Of disgusting criminality revealed in the Epstein files. So I really have just one question for you. How many of Epstein's co-conspirators have you indicted? How many perpetrators are you even investigating?
First, you showed it. I find it.
How many have you indicted?
Excuse me. I'm going to answer the question.
Answer my question.
No, I'm going to answer the question the way I want to answer the question.
No, you're going to answer the question the way I asked it.
Chairman
How many
Jordan,
have you
I'm
indicted?
not going to get in the gutter with these people.
How many?
I'm going to answer the question.
How many have you indicted?
Again, the time belongs.
Reclaiming my time.
The time belongs.
I think it's very
Reclaiming my time.
I think it's very interesting.
You can
When
reclaim
he
your time.
talks about they indicted.
Mr.
The
Chairman.
president said they indicted him.
Mr. Chairman, please stop the clock and restore his time.
He will be-
Reclaiming
Time
my
belongs to
time
the
and
gentleman
back
from
the
New
clock,
York.
please.
We will give you a few more seconds. We will do that. But when
Reclaiming
you
my-
ask the question, the
The
witness
question
gets to
was-
answer. You may not like the answer, but she
Right.
gets to
The
answer.
question was, how many of Epstein's...
They don't like the answer, Chairman,
Reclaiming my time.
because it's honest.
Reclaiming
So he asked a
Reclaiming my
4-minute question.
Restore 45 seconds to Mr. Nadler, please, Mr. Chairman.
Answer.
You can let her filibuster all day long, but not on our watch.
Reclaiming-
Not on our time. No way. And I told you about that, Attorney General, before you started.
Tell me.
Yeah, I did tell you because we saw what you did in the Senate.
Lawyer, not even a lawyer.
Committee will be in order.
I should get back at least 45 seconds.
We will give you a few more seconds. I said that already.
45 seconds.
By the way, when Pam Bondi, tries to discredit Jamie Raskin, I think he's a professor or at Harvard with a law degree from Harvard, and she's like, "You're not even a practicing attorney." I can't remember where she got her law degree. It's probably the University of Florida, but it's like I'm sure Jamie Raskin's knowledge of the law is infinite compared to Pam Bondi, but I can tell you Pam Bondi's knowledge of how to use the law to cover up absolute fraud is probably next to none, quite frankly, and that's why she's in the position. But she does ask a really important question here that we're going to get to.
Okay, I'm timing right now, Mr. Nadler. Go ahead.
Reclaiming my time. The answer to my question, how many of Epstein's co-conspirators has she indicted, is 0. You have been the Attorney General for a whole year, and your DOJ fired the lead prosecutor of this case, sat on evidence this entire time, and claimed falsely last July that there were no more leads. It took an act of Congress for you to finally release part of the Epstein files, and when you did, you included personal information about the victims while protecting the names of abusers.
Time of the gentleman
None of the
has
perpetrators have been
expired.
brought to justice, but enormous resources
Time of the
dedicated to
gentleman has
pursuing Trump's
expired, and
It's
obviously
clear that under your leadership, the Department of Justice
there was
no longer
no
works
question
for
in there.
It works
to
for
respond
Donald
to.
Trump. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
May I answer?
I think our next questioner, Madam Attorney General, is going to give you time to respond to
Thank you, Chairman.
all kinds of things. So we will turn to the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes.
Ms. Bondi, you go right ahead. I'm over here. The time is yours.
Thank you. First, he brought up the president saying they indicted me twice. They sure did. They tried to impeach him twice. And you, Mr. Nadler, were one of the leads on the impeachment. I was on the other side. I lived that with you. During impeachment, you said the president conspired, sought foreign interference in the 2016 election. Robert Mueller found no evidence, none, of foreign interference in 2016. Have you apologized to President Trump? Have you apologized to President Trump, all of you who participated in those impeachment hearings against Donald Trump? You all should be apologizing. You sit here and you attack the president, and I am not going to have it. I'm not going to put up with it. You know, all they want to do, all the American people need to know this. They are talking about Epstein today. This has been around since the Obama administration. This administration released over 3 million pages of documents, over 3 million. And Donald Trump signed that law to release all of those documents. He is the most transparent president in the nation's history.
And the incompetence of the Department of Justice or somebody in the FBI or someone that's on our side basically released a lot of information indicting Donald Trump and all sorts of pedophilia that is just disgusting, that is still redacted. And they, had 1,000 FBI agents working on overtime to redact this stuff. It's a circus of insanity, but the whole system is imploding on itself because, as you can see, this through line with Kathy Rumler to Pam Bondi to Obama, it's like, yeah, this is 2026. As I said, in a couple of truth bombs ago, I interviewed David Enrich. I've got this relationship with the deputy investigator editor for the New York Times who just, 3 months ago revealed all of this forensic evidence of the relationships between Jeffrey Epstein and JP Morgan Chase through Jess Staley. And that was just one piece of it. And it was an incredible revelation considering it's 2026 now. It was 2025 when he did it. And I got to ask the question to David Enrich. I was like, look, man, it's 2026. Where were you guys when all of this other stuff was happening? And he got prickly because the whole thing has been a massive carnage of cover up the whole time. And it's imploding right before our eyes. But everybody is lying to you. And I have the information that makes it all make sense of what they've been doing, how and why, and who did what, when, and how. And ultimately, it's the confluence of my work over the last 13 years. And I'll get to that part. This is going way longer than I wanted to. But at the same time, my God, people, you've got to get this through your skulls. And you got to wrap your mind around our entire system has failed because of complicity, duplicity, and lack of character because of liars that are paid to be involved with this mountain of lies because of all of these other things that have been going on. And ultimately, as huge as it is, again, what I'm telling you is Epstein is the tip of the iceberg. And quite frankly, it's the magic key. If for those of you who are fans of, let's say, The Hobbit, right? They had that key to get into, obviously, oh my God, where all the treasure is and it's buried inside the mountain. That's what I'm carrying. I'm carrying, the Lost Ark, the Arkenstone, the Rosetta Stone, any other metaphor that you can think of that just will expose all of this. If it can just penetrate the noise that we're all being subsumed by to provide the clarity of truth that I've spent literally 13 years being able to bring this to the fore. But I'll continue and then I'll get to the closing remarks here, hopefully.
And none of them asked Merrick Garland over the last 4 years one word about Jeffrey Epstein. How ironic is that? You know why? Because Donald Trump, the Dow right now.
Okay, and she goes in to say it's $50,000 when the metric of 50,000 is, the volume of frequency, which indicates the stock market going up, which is ironic because really at the end, it is all about that. The wealth of, let's just say, the top 10%, but the top 1% more importantly, and the top 0.01%, which is the Epstein class that have been involved with this whole thing that I'm revealing to you. And then let's see what happens next here. I could go, oh, okay. So another giant piece of this, and you can see it all over the place, is, we have all of these experts that can tell you everything that Epstein says and did and what he was involved with and everything else. But what I found when I reviewed this was it's better to hear it from the horse's mouth. And in this particular interview, this brings it all together in a myriad of ways. But this is Steve Bannon interviewing Jeffrey Epstein. Take a listen to this.
On Sunday afternoon, September 14th, 2008, where were you?
Sorry.
It was the night they put Lehman Brothers in bankruptcy in London.
I was in jail.
Seriously?
Yes.
So the financial crisis of 2008 happened when you were in jail?
Yes.
Oh, this is going to be so amazing. That's going to be so amazing. I take it you didn't have your Wall Street Journal dropped off to you in the morning, your Financial Times?
No.
How did you hear about how did you hear about, because I want
I forgot about this, but yes.
I'm trying to get this. Is going to be amazing. This is let's go back and do that again. Sunday afternoon, because I want to find out about people, the geniuses understanding the complexity of the financial system. Because I think the best example we have is the financial crisis of the crash of 2008. Sunday afternoon, September 14th, I think it was, 2008, is when they were working feverishly in Midtown Manhattan at the Lehman Brothers offices and at various law firms around town, and with the Secretary of Treasury and the Federal Reserve, what they're going to do with Lehman. They decided they weren't going to save it. And so they prepared to put it into bankruptcy at the open of the market in London the next day. How did you hear about what was going to happen to Lehman Brothers, and what did you immediately think when you heard that it was going to be put into bankruptcy?
I'm glad you asked that question. I was in solitary confinement September 14th. And again, some of the public stories about the wonderful time I had in jail and my work release, which didn't come till months after. I'd been there since June in an 8x10 cell with a bed in the back, 6-foot bed in the back, a chrome sink with a toilet attached to it, and a little piece of metal sticking out that was supposed to act as a table. Now, since I was in jail, there were no books. Why? There's no library. No library, but you're in jail. No, I was in jail, not prison. So in jail, I was in a place which was called the Special Housing Unit, which is for the roughest, toughest, meanest people. They had put me there, they said, for my own protection. So I was in a 8x10 cell with a little slit in the door where they would serve my food on a tray about 9 inches by 4 inches. And then as soon as I finished eating, they'd take the tray and close it down. And one of the guards said, do you understand there's Wall Street's crashing. I'm worried about my pension fund. What should I do? And I said, sorry, Wall Street's crashing. What's happened? And he said, there's some crisis and some companies are going bankrupt. I said, are you sure? And he said, yeah, it's all over the papers. We're all terrified. We're going to lose our life savings because we have either a 401k or our pension funds. We don't know anything about money. Mr. Epstein, can you tell us what's going on? Am I going to be able to afford my children's education? Am I going to be bankrupt like this company called Lehman Brothers? And there's another company in the front page today called Bear Stearns. Oh no, I said. Why? Because that's the company I was a partner in. And in fact, that was a company I had a very large investment in. So, as a great story, I didn't have my Wall Street Journal, but in the early mornings, you're allowed to make 2 phone calls, collect. And when you pick up the phone, you can dial a number. And when the person picks up, they say, you're getting a call from the Palm Beach County Jail. Will you accept reverse charges? And the person either says yes, and the call goes through, or the person says no. The person I had called was Jimmy Kane, the president of Bear Stearns. And I said, tell me what's going on. And so that my knowledge of the financial crisis happened with Jimmy, who was at the center of the storm, telling me about what Lehman had gone under. And they were trying to figure out a way, should they bail out Bear Stearns?
Did it strike you at the time of the mess you had made of your life to be in a situation that you're one of the greatest financial minds in the world, looked at by world leaders and asked your thinking by the most prominent and important people in the world, and here you are in solitary confinement. You got to make a collect call to somebody. Did it strike you at the time how all the threads of your life had come together and put you in a position, or you had put yourself in that position?
No.
So it never struck you when you had to make one of your 50% of your collect calls that day, you call the president or the head of the CEO of Bear Stearns, the biggest financial event in your life is taking place, of which one, every important person in the world would be seeking your opinion. Number two would be a once in a lifetime opportunity to apply your craft. Number three, it would be a once in a lifetime opportunity to make money if you were smart, and obviously you're smart. You're telling me here, truthfully, that it never hit you at all of how you'd ended up in a place where you had to make a collect phone call from a jail cell that was 6x9 with a steel bed and your food being passed into a slot.
The question you want to ask is, who was the other call to?
Okay, who was the other call to?
The other call was to my friend at J.P. Morgan, who was then, I didn't know it at the time, trying to buy Bear Stearns.
Okay. Eureka. I'm going to backfill that information. But my God. Okay. First of all, again, I'm going to remind you who I am, especially for those of you who are just seeing this for the first time. I should probably be a household name by this time, but I've been quashed. I've been quashed by the biggest, most powerful companies and apparatuses in the world. And, similar to those of you who basically to test the idea of the Epstein victims being quashed and nobody heard their story, I've got a similar situation, obviously different, but in so much that after the great financial crisis of 2008, I was able to, as a producer, ask the right questions, start to pull some threads. And one thing led to another. And I hooked up with somebody I knew, and he's from one of the most powerful families in the United States. And he agreed to seed my sort of impetus as a filmmaker and as somebody, and I stated this many times in my truth bombs, but I studied political science when I was in college. I also minored in journalism. I went on to work in Hollywood. My life has been very adventurous. I've done all sorts of stuff, but I've always been an activist and also very sort of inclined towards political awareness and understandings of power vectors and this, that, and the other. But that wasn't really my focus in my career. I just wanted to become a producer, a director, somebody who made films, all those sorts of things. And my journey, as I've mentioned previously, carried me into Hollywood, where I work for some of these characters that are caught up in this whole thing. But it wasn't until many years later that after the great financial crisis happened, and I had my young family at the time, and I was into my first house, even though I was an old guy, and I was literally doing very well. But then all of a sudden, several years into it, the world collapsed, and I got caught up in this avalanche that buried me, and I knew things weren't right. And I started asking questions, and miraculously, I found this guy of great means who and still do to a degree, believed had a good soul and really skewed towards integrity and maybe truth, I guess. And I did for most of our relationship. I still hold this person in a very high regards, but he agreed to enable me to move into this situation. And I created my first documentary film, Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, which then would ultimately lead to this long form series called The Con. And Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream was basically prologue, where I was able to lap the country during during the Occupy Wall Street movement. And we've got it available for free, and I'll put it in the description below. But if you watch it, and you'll see that the questions I ask are as relevant today as they were 13 years ago when we released this thing. And I'm going to show you something very important momentarily. But it was like the segue where I was able to start putting my mind around everything that was going on in this huge labyrinth of lies. That I kept pulling the thread and pulling the thread and pulling the thread. And because I had resources, I was able to ask the right questions to the right people because I spent thousands and thousands of hours researching everything that was going on at the time to be able to lead me into the situation where we would wind up making The Con. And ultimately, The Con got, like I mentioned earlier, quashed by the most powerful interest in the world. And they're all tied to the situation that I'm telling you. But I'm going to show you the trailer first of The Con, and I'm sorry that it doesn't have music because I'd encourage you, I'll put the link in the description below. I'd encourage you to seek it out on YouTube because it just looks and sounds a lot better. But because YouTube has a situation with the rights of music and everything else where it can't replay it when I'm recording it. But hopefully you'll get a feeling of the indication of who I am and what I've been through to get to where I am, given everything I'm revealing to you.
I'm neither an economist or a scholar. I'm just an average American who lost my home and very nearly my family to foreclosure when the market imploded. And I've spent almost every day since trying to find out why. Once the dust settled, it quickly became clear that my story was no different than millions of other Americans. We all thought that we were alone. We all thought that we'd failed. But none of us really knew why.
With a gun in her hand, Patty Polk apparently shot herself in the chest as deputies were knocking on her door with eviction papers in hand.
Dramatic increase in mortgage fraud cases was the canary in the mine. It was the warning.
This was money chasing people. This was not somebody looking for a loan.
It was all designed to maximize profits for all of the different players.
The person who sold you a loan made more money if they sold you a higher rate loan.
They were sold a lot.
They're selling to their very clients these loans that they know are a disaster.
I lost my home, not because of money, because of fraud.
I don't believe Addie Polk took out the mortgage on her home. I don't believe she signed any documents.
They just generated all this junk, took home huge bonuses, and then when it collapsed, they said, oh, not us.
This notion that the financial crisis was there wasn't fraud and there wasn't crime is absolutely wrong. It's dead.
They were targeting, in many cases, minorities.
We were waiting for the leadership to say, go. That never happened.
The investigation was suppressed.
This was all part of the same puzzle that was falling apart.
This is the largest conspiracy of lies in the history of the world.
This investigation has just begun.
So I want to comment on this first. You might be thinking to yourself, so what's the correlation to Epstein? Well, first and foremost, on the victim side, I think we're all, millions of you, tens of millions of you, the people who are like, release the Epstein files and the victims, and this is all about the victims. And it is to a large degree because of it's a perversion of justice and the entire system is involved with covering it up. But I think we can all recognize now without any apprehension, and we have full clarity on this, that young girls were predated upon and they were set up in a trap, right? Where let's say they didn't have a lot of resources and maybe they had aspirations in their life, like going to college or maybe living a better life and so on and so forth. And they were brought into this like beautiful world. It kind of feels to me like the parable of the Hotel California, the song. You can check it in any time you like, but you can never leave because of just the monstrosity of perversion that was happening behind the scenes, right? we all now know they were basically served on a platter to basically perverted, sick men primarily, and I'm sure all sorts of other twisted stuff as well, but to become trafficked and become slaves in the sex trafficking scenario. And we're just horrified by this, right? They weren't prostitutes as we hear all the time. They were children. And yet they were completely predated upon. Now, the corollary in terms of the mechanism to what I just showed you was primarily the housing collapse was about using liar's loans to trap anybody who needed, shall we say, security. And what I've learned throughout this whole process, a lot of the times, there's probably nothing more important to a woman, but particularly to an elderly woman, than a home and security, right? And so in the case, what we show you is Addie Polk, who was an African-American woman, 91 years old. She had lived in her house for several decades, 4 decades to be exact, and she owned her house. It was like the ultimate achievement for African Americans of her stature who escaped the South during the Great Migration after Jim Crow and the industrial Northwest, Midwest. Her husband worked several jobs to ultimately afford finally to own a house that when he passed away, he left her a pension, fixed income, where she had security. But that house was stolen from her in a predation scenario that we lay out in the con, okay? And Addie Polk was a target because A, she didn't have resources to defend herself. She was a minority. She was an elderly woman, and she had resources like a house that they could predate upon, okay? That's first and foremost. Second of all, she was one of millions. And it wasn't just, the housing industry didn't just target minorities. It ultimately got everybody in this giant scam that was the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world, as we revealed to you. That also, when I show you the people that I got to testify in the con, what you saw there was the former director of investigations for the FBI, third highest guy in the FBI, who did a national, investigation to pull the news around this predation, first and foremost, okay? But he got kneecapped by then the Bush administration because, among other things, the largest contributor to the Bush administration was a gentleman by the name of Roland Arnault, who ran the largest subprime operation in the country, even bigger than what we showed you. Angelo Mazzillo, who had Countrywide, but it was even bigger at AmeriQuest, okay? And there's a whole series of things that we reveal. But the con is a 5-part series that gives you the details of every aspect of what took place that the entirety of our government, particularly the Department of Justice, didn't do. And in fact, in that trailer, you also saw 2 other very marquee people. Everybody was, but a gentleman who was the top investigator at the Department of Justice, incidentally, was deeply, deeply involved in the investigation during Obama's administration to AIG that was connected to all things Bear Stearns, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and that's another story, okay? And then there was also, which is even equally important, a gentleman by the name of Dick Bowen. Richard Bowen was a C-suite level guy. He was the chief of investigations for doing the kind of button up in all of the files that Citigroup was selling to pensions and all of these other things around the world in the largest, like I told you, racketeering enterprise in the history of the world that was taking all of these mortgage-backed securities that were bundled through these warehouse lines that were provided by these investment banks like JP Morgan Chase, and I should say more importantly, Goldman Sachs, Bear Stearns, Morgan Stanley, and so forth, but also Citigroup. And because of who Richard Bowen was and what he did, because it was his job to look into the files and discover whether or not they met the reps and warranties to be able to sell into the secondary market. And he started sending emails to the senior leadership at at Citigroup, and ultimately was quashed because he was revealing all of the information that he was finding because they were selling $85 billion a year of fraudulent securities. And that was helmed by none other than Robert Rubin, who at the time was the chairman of the board, of Citigroup, but he came out of the Secretary of the Treasury. But before that, he was at Goldman Sachs. So this is a long line of scenarios that took place. And Richard Bowen went so far as to email the red flags of not meeting the reps and warranties, which were part of what we call the oh my God, what was it? The law that happened during the Bush administration to make sure that all of these companies were responsible for the reps and warranties, because there was so much fraud at the time that was coming out of Enron and all of these other things that, of course, Kathy Brumler was involved with it as well. And anyway, long story short, he couldn't get this story out there and ultimately was quashed by the Borg, and we reveal all. And in addition to all of these giant elements that I'm revealing to you, the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission, as created by the government of the United States to look into what created the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, put none other than Pam Bondi's brother at the apex of this investigation to ultimately, I found out later, quash Richard Bowen's testimony. And he ultimately became a partner at none other than Citigroup. Now, the other aspect of Citigroup, by the way, is that Sandy Weil was the chief executive of Citigroup during what was then the largest deregulatory activity in the history of finance, minus what was before the Great Depression. But he understood all of these manifestations of fraud and created supermarket banking with none other than Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon was his protege, and their focus back in 1998, before they got the opportunity to get engaged with Citigroup, they were in Baltimore involved with none other than predatory lending, okay? And then Jamie Dimon went to Bank One, which was also involved with it in Ohio with Les Wexner. And Les Wexner, of course, we know was Jeffrey Epstein's, we could call him sugar daddy, but he signed over in his, which never happens, power of attorney by a multi-billionaire to Jeffrey Epstein to conduct all of these businesses that led to him buying literally the most expensive piece of real estate in Manhattan. Do you have any idea how many billionaires and important people live in Manhattan? And Jeffrey Epstein had the most prolific piece of real estate that was right next door to Howard Lutnick. And we just learned yesterday from Zev Shalev and others that the FBI had information on Howard Lutnick that they sat on. That's part of the Epstein files, okay? But Jeffrey Epstein, the background was he comes out of Dalton. He doesn't graduate from college. He gets a job at Bear Stearns because supposedly, and again, the headmaster of Dalton was the father of Bill Barr, who became, I think assistant attorney general during Bush 1, who was, of course, before that, director of the CIA, and then father of Bush 2. And then ultimately he comes back in during the Trump administration's first term to become attorney general when, of course, Jeffrey Epstein suicided himself. But the background of all of these scenarios, given what I just laid out to you, was that when Jeffrey Epstein was in prison, the first question after the collapse of Lehman Brothers was he called none other than Jimmy Kane, the CEO of Bear Stearns, and then, of course, Jess Staley, who I think is CFO, but he was second in line at JP Morgan Chase, okay? Now, again, what did I show you at the beginning with Kathy Brumler, right? She comes out of the Justice Department. She's involved with the prosecution of Enron, which is 2004-ish, 2003, 2004-ish, massive derivative scenario. By the way, that came from, remember I just mentioned the situation with Citigroup, which was led by Sandy Weil, and Jamie Dimon was a protege. And they worked with none other than Phil Gramm, who was this powerful senator from Texas, and his wife, Wendy Lee Graham, who was also on the board of directors for Enron, that were responsible for the deregulation effort during the Clinton administration, of which a protege of theirs was none other than Russell Vogt. Russell Vogt, who became basically the author of Project 2025, working for the Heritage Foundation, and responsible for this calamity of corruption, I should say fascism, that we're all in the midst of, and what I'll get into the remedy for that in a moment. But the nature of Sandy Weil And JP Morgan Chase, Epstein also involved this. Turns out Citigroup was financing the Air America Part 2 that was run out of Columbus, that was deeply involved with whatever Les Wexner was involved with also Epstein. And Les Wexner was the billionaire of the Limited. And of course, of course, the women's lingerie, the biggest company that had the huge night on. Oh my God, it goes on, and you know what I'm talking about, which was deeply involved with this whole thing, right? So you've got the honeypot intelligence scenario with billionaires that led Jeffrey Epstein to have this incredible cache of cash, CHE of CHAS, right? To be able to do things that somebody with his background should never have been able to do. And yet, if you listen to the New York Times, they said he was just a grifter the whole time, meaning Jeffrey Epstein, who stole all this stuff. Okay, there's so many red flags and there's so many players on this whole thing that go back even long before. And I encourage you to read some great work by Zev Shalev on his website, on Substack, that is The Greatest Heist. And he takes some major liberties, by the way, creative liberties, which is a little dangerous for him, I'm sure. But he connects Russia and all of these things and Trump and yada, yada, yada through Contragrade and originally Robert Maxwell, who was Ghislaine Maxwell's father, and his involvement with all things intelligence. And of course, more importantly, the Promise software. And for those of you who might know the Duplass brothers documentary, The Octopus Murders, I think might still be on Netflix, is a super, super important piece of this puzzle, which germinates what I think this is ultimately all about. But ultimately, the next level of this, as I demonstrated in terms of the carnage of predation that actually destroyed tens of millions of people, led to more information that I was able to ascertain, and I was never able to get off the ground in what was season 2 of The Con. So check this out.
I mean, it was just 2008, 2010, where there were entire streets that had foreclosure signs.
You had millions of people asking for help on their loans to companies that had no interest in helping them.
We were being lied to. City mortgage employees continually lied to us over the phone. When I asked them specific questions, they would never answer the questions.
My husband had a spinal cord injury, rendering him paralyzed. So Wells Fargo offered us a loan modification. They didn't return phone calls. They provided me misinformation. People were being paid to lie to us, paid to disappear, and they never had any intention of helping us.
Several employees from Bank of America were given Target and Best Buy gift cards for foreclosing on homeowners.
These were just document mills that would just sign any piece of paper that was necessary in order to convince a judge to let him take the house.
All of the documents that were signed by these robots, they sit behind me. It's 39,000. And they're all fraudulent. These banks, they were a front. They were a front for criminal enterprise.
Our whole regulatory system was a failure when it came to this issue.
Jury was kept from seeing my aunt's exculpatory evidence. The evidence that was pro Barbara got shut out.
I heard from a former Chief Justice, you know that the outcome is dependent upon where the judge believes he's been placed in the revenue stream. Who does him the biggest financial favors? So in other words, you're saying that they're bought off.
At the time that I was running, I challenged my opponent not to take money from any banks that got government bailout money. And I did get a call from Washington telling me to be careful because there were a lot of people who got that money who were in my party.
Where people can get away with stuff, they will. And the best place to get away with stuff is have a big corporation that's traded on the stock exchange that gives a lot of money to lobbyists and politicians and make it so complicated that nobody can ever figure out what the fuck you did. Then you win.
There is an alarm to be sounded in the aftermath of 2008. It is when you have too much wealth in too few hands, the rule of law begins to collapse.
All the Americans who are still out of work, got low wages, huge student debts, underwater homes. All these problems are a direct result of the financial crash.
The failure to rescue the American working and middle class in the Great Recession, that has set us on the trajectory to where we find ourselves today.
It's fight between Main Street and Wall Street, between big banks and real people.
I'm not supposed to win. Borrower's not supposed to win. That is this game. Is if you've got the money, you can make them all, or you can buy them all.
No individual faced any accountability for any of this.
I have a new definition for the perfect crime. Perfect crime is a crime that involves everybody.
Do you know what the American people would do if those leaders of those banks were indicted? It would send a message loud and clear that the game's over. And we let them off the hook. We let them off the hook.
The only way it's going to change is the same way it was affected, which was millions of people have finally fucking had it.
So I'm going to take this off share for a second, just to try to put all of this together at the moment, and then move into the next and final piece of this. And yeah, this is going along a lot longer than I anticipated, and of course, not under the best circumstances. But I've got to deliver this information because I'm the only one who has all of the information that's willing to talk about it. What we all know is that this is the Epstein class, right? And you can all see that it spans many decades, many presidential administrations, that Epstein is relevant now because it's finally leaking through, and we're starting to see the unbelievably dark and insanity of this Epstein class that is above the law, which is really why I went on this journey to begin with. Now, what you saw on the second trailer there was information that I have on the shelf. Now, I did do a 21-part podcast series called The New Untouchables, the Pecora Files, that you can find, and I'll put a link in the description below, that reveals a lot of the information that I had on the shelf. Now, the first trailer that I showed you of the con, we made that available for free for the last 3 years. And we really couldn't penetrate the noise and the bubble to get people to watch it because of just the nature, all of the noise and what people would rather tune in and tune out, quite frankly. But at the same time, it was all of the details of everything that I'm revealing to you at a high level that the entirety of the federal government had hit, okay? And again, I've got like another 5 or 10 episodes on the shelf if I could ever get it out there. But at the same time, you know, this is what the $90 billion apparatus of our federal government, including the Department of Justice, the FBI, the SEC, and everybody else couldn't do because of corruption, because of the Epstein class. And like that victim from, you know, the Epstein scenario said, she felt like she got raped by the Department of Justice for a second time because of what was going on with Epstein, of course. I think there's 1,400 women that are associated with this Epstein sex trafficking scenario that involves the global elite, which of course just means above the law because of everything that we're revealing to you. What I'm revealing to you are literally tens of millions of victims that led to a calamity that started with a $4.5 trillion housing bubble, that led to a $900 trillion global calamity, that in the aftermath, there was a smoke and mirrors during the Obama administration where the government, i.e. Congress, pretended like we saved the world by providing $700 billion in liquidity, because Congress is supposedly the power of the purse, to stem the liquidity crisis of 2008, which just simply means the entire system was bankrupt because of racketeering. But what we did secretively was we maneuvered behind the scenes where all media, just like what I demonstrated earlier with Kathy Brumler, and how they ask the wrong questions and how they cover up and how they don't know how to put all of these pieces together because that's not what they're paid to do. They ultimately hid what I uncovered, which led to 98 secret meetings behind the scenes with then Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson, which would then lead to Timothy Geithner, who became the Federal Reserve Chairman after Ben Bernanke is who took over from Alan Greenspan, who enabled all of this stuff. And it goes back to the savings and loan crisis. And that's why he became the maestro, for those who know, because it all emanated from the savings and loan crisis, by the way, of which my mentor, a guy by the name of William K. Black, put over 7,000 of these bastards in prison because we know how to do investigations and bring in the indictments and bring these guys into court and have them go to prison if you have a functioning law. That was given up in the late 90s to create deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization, starting with the Clinton administration in cahoots with Phil Gramm, which led to this nightmare of Russell Vogt and all things what we're in the midst of. And those of you who follow my story know I always say corruption birds and fuels fascism. But all of these things that were happening with Citigroup and Bank One and ultimately Chase, they were all this nexus that were also involved with intelligence, okay? Because when my partner Eric and Vaughn and I initially did our first film, Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, and we followed the Occupy Wall Street movement from coast to coast. We traveled 7,500 miles in a span of, I think, 2.5 months in a car together in this extraordinary situation where we started to deconstruct the power paradigm, which I would ultimately lay out was the fossil fuel, financial, military, industrial paradigm that was pulling the strings. Because I had to learn macroeconomics, I had to further my understanding of geopolitics, and I had to understand history as it was sorting itself out. And again, in our lifetimes, going back to Contrigate and all of these things that are kind of the first domino that are also a continuation of what came before because of the Cold War and CIA and KGB and what they've been doing forever, would manifest this situation with Robert Maxwell and the Promise Software, and all of these things that would come down the pike that would really be a nexus with Jeffrey Epstein. And of course, he reveals himself at the beginning where he says, or I should say in that Bannon interview, where he says he makes the 2 phone calls. That's the ultimate revelation to Jimmy Kane and to Jess Staley. Jimmy Kane at Bear Stearns and Jess Staley at JP Morgan Chase. And, as I reach back in the memory banks here, the crazy thing for me personally was 2 things. When Eric and I were traveling the country and we were picking up all of these pieces in Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, which is prologue to everything that happens in the con. And again, I'll have it free down below. But I remember when we got to Manhattan and we got to basically Zuccotti Park, which is right across the street from Maiden Lane, okay? Everybody was telling us at that time that there were 2 things that we need to be focused on. First was there was $70 trillion in global appetite that was looking for a place to park. That was the mechanism that basically created these warehouse lines where international money that was coming from all sorts of strange actors. Now, at the time, I was just thinking it was like the rising middle class in India and China that, were working through all sorts of different, brokers, to find a place to park their capital and like the middle class of the United States before, use this newfound wealth to grow. And it was safe because everybody considered the American housing industry, AAA. And it was, quite frankly, before all of this got shattered because of really the mechanisms of neoliberalism and 5 decades of killing the golden goose, okay? And the next step of that was when Eric and I started asking questions, we started hearing about the, what was that? Oh my God, there's so much information. It'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, it's a mechanism of deregulation that allowed these investment banks to trade on their own accord. So they could front run, they could do certain things that would lead to what would be uncovered later in the revelations of all things Goldman Sachs as it related to Fabulous Torre and this incredible hearing by former Michigan Senator Carl Levin, who actually got emails that the executives at Goldman Sachs knew that they were selling the worst of the worst liar's loans to pensions and governments around the country. And this guy, Fabulous Touré, was the guy who was involved with it. But ultimately, that was as far as the investigation went. And that was actually simultaneously while the how do I want to bridge this? That was happening simultaneously as there was another investigation that didn't get subpoena power on the two traders at Bear Stearns, Coffey and Tannen, who were selling all sorts of liar's loans into the system, that the entire repo mechanisms in which banks loan to each other overnight lending knew that there were all lies, that the collateral that banks use to basically create interest rates and all sorts of other scenarios in which they trade back and forth was all a lie and built on a house of cards. And the giant vampire squid, Goldman Sachs, started to let it be known on Wall Street that the collateral that Bear Stearns had was all a lie. So they created a run that they, unbeknownst to the rest of Wall Street, had shorted, otherwise known as the Big Short. Raise your hand if you saw the movie Brad Pitt and Christian Bale, made by Plan B, based on the book by Michael Lewis called The Big Short, where Christian Bale did his, research, as did, the 40-year-old virgin, Steve Carell's character, who was a part of this, hedge fund that got information from none other than the wonderful actor who, of course, is in La La Land and Barbie and everything else. He played the broker at at Deutsche Bank, who revealed it was a house of cards. Okay, that they all supposedly did their homework, and Christian Bale represented the character Michael Burry, who was the real hedge funder that is legendary because he made $500 million on The Big Short. That collapsed the entire market. That Bear Stearns created a run because they knew that Bear Stearns was selling the lies, but there was a reason why they knew they were selling the lies, aka The Big Short. But to put it into perspective, Michael Burry, who was the real life hedge funder who did this, made $500 million from that trade. Meanwhile, Goldman Sachs was working with another hedge fund that was run by a guy by the name of John Paulson and his lieutenant Paolo Pellegrini, who was doing the same thing. And when everything collapsed, they made out with, remember Michael Burry, 500 million. John Paulson, his hedge fund made out with 20 billion. To this day, it's the largest trade in the history of Wall Street. According to Greg Zuckerman, who I interviewed for season 2 of The Con, and I have on the shelf, it was the biggest trade in history by magnitudes. The largest trade in history before that was, of course, none other than everybody's favorite boogeyman, George Soros, who made $1 billion on a trade shorting the English sterling back in the late 90s. Okay. John Paulson made 20 billion. Famously, Greg Zuckerman said he backed up the Brinks truck. Now, in my interview with Greg Zuckerman, several things happened that are extremely important for you to understand. First and foremost, Zuckerman, again, the Wall Street Journal editor, gold standard. I'm not sure if he's got a Pulitzer, but at the same time, he wrote this book, The Greatest Trade Ever. So his bona fides are significant. First, he told me everybody knew what was going on Wall Street, but everybody knows that they have to follow the leadership because of called incentives, first and foremost. Okay. And second of all, meaning the liar's loans, what they were putting in the liar's securities, in which, by the way, the movie The Big Short does symbolize and amplify quite effectively, not as effectively as Margot Robbie trying to describe credit default swaps, which were ultimately what Jeffrey Epstein was making the phone call to Jimmy Kane about. Ultimately, that involved both Bear Stearns and J.P. Morgan. But later in the film, they have the revelation of the credit rating agencies that, among others, were owned by Warren Buffett, and that's Moody's, where they were basically showing the people that were responsible for regulating this stuff with sunglasses on. So they could see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil kind of thing, because they were getting incentivized to pay for it. And everybody was incentivized. And if you saw the con, which is now basically hidden because this stuff is so important and dangerous. And I don't know why it's on the shelf right now. I can only speculate. But ultimately, what we reveal because of my work with William K. Black is to understand the nature of what took place in the 90s because of modern executive compensation, changes to regulation that took place during Clinton, and ultimately what he calls perverse incentives. Sound a little bit like the whole case that I just made between Epstein and the liar's loans of predation? It is the same thing, but at different scales. Okay. And so ultimately, Goldman Sachs triggers the short. Now, another grand sort of kaleidoscope of information that I've got sitting on the shelves that are equally as important was because I interviewed the former director of investigations of white collar fraud that had put together this nationwide dragnet. And by the way, he was a Republican working in a Republican administration. And he knew all of these different variables. And he says in the con directly to us, all of what I'm telling you. And this is inside information that was made public, but nobody in the media could put two and two together because they were too busy doing things like making Donald Trump the apprentice. Because as Les Moonves, the former executive at CBS, said, he was great for ratings. And that goes for CNN as well through, the former president that had to step down as well, Jeffrey Zucker. And it was all a facade manifesting this giant, enormous global capital flow of $70 trillion into our markets that would pump up the subprime where everybody was getting a piece. And as we showed you in the first trailer, that this involved tens of millions of felonies in the liar's loans and the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world that would ultimately now, as you can see, starting with, of course, Brumler, that we're now seeing was the general counsel at Goldman Sachs at the same time period who came out of investigating Enron. And then she was in the Obama administration. And then she miraculously becomes the general counsel of Goldman Sachs. And ultimately, she is buddy-buddy with Jeffrey Epstein. And, and Jeffrey Epstein makes those two phone calls because of what he said at the end of that interview. Well, because of where I ended up during the Occupy Wall Street scenario, because of what we uncovered. And we were part of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was right there on Maiden Lane. Because Jeffrey Epstein had a hedge fund that was called Liquid Capital that was involved with Bear Stearns, that was, I believe, pumping significant money from Russia through Deutsche Bank and other apparatuses into all of these other financial situations, that they were also doing collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps to set this whole thing up. Because Goldman knew, and this was the one thing I didn't finish with Goldman, because in my relationship with the former director of investigations of FBI, because of other conversations I had with him, he turned me on to other whistleblowers that were people he was investigating that were former felons that were involved with selling liars loans all over the country. But they had two major vectors. One was Seattle, and you guys might remember the huge bank in Seattle that collapsed that JP Morgan absorbed. And then ultimately in Jacksonville, Florida, which was a part of Black Knight. And that's a whole nother situation that involves Pam Bondi, by the way. And ultimately, they were feeding John Paulson's and this goes to my information I have from Greg Zuckerman, his hedge fund that was the biggest trade in the history of the world because they shorted, Goldman Sachs shorted all of these liars' loans into all sorts of pensions and countries of the world, of which ended up, by the way, in front of the Supreme Court between 2020 that I know of, maybe a year earlier than that, in 2023, where the Supreme Court was hearing a case from the Arkansas Teachers Pension Union, the Pipe Fitters of America, and the Plumbers of America that had a class action against Goldman Sachs for what it is I'm telling you, that I have the information of, right? Because what they were handpicking, meaning John Paulson was handpicking the worst of the worst liars' loans that they set as time bombs through all of these different vectors, that they blew up all of these different pensions and countries and everything else, including the country of Greece. And if you look into my truth bomb riffs, I have an incredible interview with none other than former Greek finance minister and incredible genius, global, one of the smartest people in the world, a guy by the name of Yanis Varoufakis, who tells us in the aftermath of the great financial crisis during the implosion that none other than John Paulson came in and literally bought all of Greece. Okay? The same John Paulson that blew up the working class, that ultimately raised all sorts of money for Donald Trump during this past presidential election down in Mar-a-Lago, that was being potentially gleaned to become Treasury Secretary. At least we forget Steve Mnuchin was Trump's first Treasury Secretary, who came out of Goldman, who was involved with all this stuff as well. But ultimately, the net here is that when Barack Obama went on 60 Minutes circa 2011, I think 12, 13, somewhere in there, and he said to the country, what Wall Street did was incredibly unethical, but he says in his legalese, it wasn't necessarily illegal. Meanwhile, the whole thing was the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world, of which his Department of Justice covered up. So similar to the victim of the Epstein situation, who is now saying that it feels like she's being raped a second time by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice under Barack Obama did that to tens of millions of victims of the liars' loans predation that fed the kitty, that led to the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the world, bar none, that is a nuclear bomb of criminality, okay? Maybe a nuclear Armageddon of global criminality. Because what happened in the aftermath of all of that, because the entire global financial structure had become what they said, it was a liquidity crisis. There was no money because they were all bankrupt. And so the Federal Reserve then became illegally the power of the purse. They had 98 secret meetings with all of these people that were involved with it. Again, Hank Paulson, not to be confused with John Paulson, but they were both involved with Goldman, of course, and there's no way they didn't know about it. And Tim Geithner comes in after Greenspan splits. And of course, that was Ben Bernanke. And Geithner was the guy who let all this stuff happen as the president of the New York Federal Reserve Board that Obama ended up making his Treasury Secretary, okay? And he famously quipped that, what we're going to do is we're going to make the American people foam on the runway for the crashing financial system. Said another way, they use the Federal Reserve, as in John Paulson's terminology. What we're going to do is I've got the bazooka. He was reassuring global markets that we've got the bazooka. Stay tuned. And what they did was they created a meeting. It was relatively, I would say, it wasn't secret so much as it was people didn't understand it at the time. But the largest 13 banks in the country, and I'll put another link down below because this guy Simon Johnson did this book that I read early in the process that reveals that 13 of the largest, biggest banks came together in the aftermath where, and I'm going to conflate two different stories here, and I know it's complicated enough, but God, I hope people are hearing this because this is the whole story. Because basically, what Jeffrey Epstein revealed to Steve Bannon was he got the word from both J.P. Morgan and Bear Stearns that there was going to be a bailout of his clients, okay, which may have included, and I only preface this because I saw Ben Marcellus of the what's it called, the Midas Touch, say a couple of weeks ago that this latest tranche of Epstein files reveals that it may have been Epstein managing money for none other than Vladimir Putin. And I've got other information that Vladimir Putin and Russian oligarchs were taking all sorts of money and they were plugging it through all of these investment banks into obviously subprime. And that was part and parcel of this whole situation. But ultimately, what Epstein says, and it's ironic because I was there at Zuccotti Park, which is across the street from Maiden Lane, and it was all because of the House of Cards. And ironically, I've got to insert this as well. One of the interviews that I did was with legendary journalist on Wall Street, a guy by the name of William D. Cohen. He's well known. He interacts with all of the top powers in the world. He interacted with me as well. And when the cameras went off and he told me his whole story about how all this thing worked, and it goes back to the 80s, okay? And it goes back to, all of the stuff with the mergers and acquisitions. And of course, all of these scenarios that included Michael Milliken in the original RICO as it related to, I'll come back to that firm in a minute, but they were all deeply involved and enmeshed with junk bonds that were involved with Donald Trump's, scenario up in Atlantic City. And everything else. So everything I'm telling you is a continuation of literally many, many decades, okay? And all of the same players are involved. And it's real estate, it's honeypot situation, it's money laundering, it's intelligence, it's all of these capital cash flows and these short term scenarios and everything else. And ultimately, I know there's a point that I was just about to make that was Maiden Lane, right? So there I am, ironically, with my partner, Eric Vaughn, shooting my first film. And if you happen to see my first film, you'll see I give this speech at the end in Zuccotti Park to everybody that was a part of this Occupy Wall Street movement, where I said, I'm here to share the love of all the people around the country that have stepped up and the millions of more that are going to wake up to this information that we're revealing. Meanwhile, I didn't realize it at the time. I was right where everything took place. And it was just the beginning of my journey, not the end. I thought it was the end of my journey 13 years, well, it was really 14 years ago when we filmed it, but we didn't release it until 13 years later. But that Maiden Lane situation had 13 banks meet with the top government officials in our finance structure to sign a 3-page paper to take these massive bailouts that enabled J.P. Morgan to buy out Bear Stearns that ultimately would bail out the people that created the situation of predation, of which Jeffrey Epstein is the tip of the iceberg of. And it's ultimately the Epstein class. And this has been the journey that I've been on the entire time, right? Because ultimately, what it would lead me to understand many, many, many years later was that the Federal Reserve had 98 secret meetings that would then ultimately provide, in 2009, and this reference, all of this stuff is cited by the work of the Levy files and one of the greatest economists in the world, a guy by the name of Randall Wray, who revealed that in 2009, we provided emergency stimulus, not 700 billion through TARP, which is what the media sold us as a result of what took place during the Obama administration. But at that time, $29 trillion, which later turned out to be $33 trillion at that time period. That was then followed in 2012-ish of another mammoth infusion of emergency liquidity through what was known as quantitative easing. And that was a mechanism to ultimately create short-term interest rates, long-term, to be able to get the bad, destroyed liar's loans that were happening in this aftermath of this entire calamity of foreclosure, to take off the books of the banks and put it on the Federal Reserve. Okay, that was the trick. Now, a lot of people are going to say that our economists, that they were banknotes and there's no correlation between the money that goes into the banknotes and the real economy, but it's all a lie, because the bottom line is that they broke the rules of Federal Reserve Act 13.3 to be able to get this in, to be able to provide this liquidity in all these innovative ways to be able to cover up the largest racketeering scheme in history. And at the end of that, what I found out, which was really the most, I think, insane, all things considered, and I'll point this out in a moment, but that there was a gentleman by the name of Rajan Cohen, who was later interviewed by the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission, the same Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission that put Pam Bondi's brother in a position to cover up Richard Bowen's information. That Rajan Cohen had revealed, and I got this from a great platform called Wall Street on Parade that's done by Pam and Rob Martins, I think. I haven't read it in a long time. I don't even know if they're still doing their stuff. I don't know why it doesn't come up on my feeds. But they had revealed an interview that came to the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission with this guy named Raj Cohen, who came out of none other than Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell is the same legal firm that created the CIA. And in that information, he says, look, we didn't know how deep the collateralized debt obligations went. We knew it was all bad material. We decided to blow open the Federal Reserve Act 13.3's ability to provide the exigent lending of the full faith and credit of the United States, because this was going to create this derivatives run. And they had to do that within 24 hours to 72 hours of when Jeffrey Epstein was making that call on September 15th from prison, where he got the news right away that there was going to be a bailout that would then, of course, backstop guys that he was laundering money for through liquid capital, okay? Which may or may not have been Vladimir Putin. We don't know that. But it also involved another character that I now have to bring up, and I'm going to try to close this out because I've been going on way longer than I want to, but this is the biggest story in the history of the United States, if not the world, and I'm the only guy that's bringing it, and it's not because I'm your savior. It's because I did the work, I have the information, and I have balls, and I'm willing to tell the truth. And this has been the story of my life. And if you've got to believe me, because everything on the other side of this is the clean new deal that we have to get tens of millions of people behind to be able to showcase this. But I got to show you, because maybe one day I disappear, and I want this out there in the event that people start to discover this downstream. So when Eric and I made Forward 13, I was winging a lot of interviews on the spot. I was like working around the clock, calling ahead of where we were going to go. Remember I told you we were driving around the country 7,500 miles to be able to get interviews, to try to put together what was going on. And when we were approaching Washington, D.C., I reached out to the Defense of Democracies because I thought I was going to get an insight into the our value of democracy. And why that's more important than anything else and what it all means. Because I was creating the structure of the superstructure of what we are now calling the Epstein Class, but that I was revealing at the time is this paradigm between the fossil fuel industry, the financial industry, and then, of course, the military industrial complex, right? And I was looking at it at the time through the lens of 9/11 forward. And I wanted to find out what I could find out of the Defense of Democracies. And I ended up doing an interview with this gentleman. I want you to see this because it's going to blow your mind when you understand what this is all about.
Post 9/11. There wasn't a question in my mind that we had to respond to those attacks, and I believe that with all my heart and soul. But the question of Saudi Arabia and our continued dependence on their oil left me scratching my head. I reached out to Sebastian Gorka at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies to see what his expertise might reveal.
Most important year for us to understand why September the 11th happened. The most significant event in 1979 that we talk the least about is the siege of Mecca. 300 armed jihadists, and they were jihadists, decide that the Saudi regime is illegitimate and that Islam must be cleansed and the regime must be replaced by a truly Islamic one. These individuals with automatic weapons walked into Mecca, started firing their automatic weapons inside the Grand Mosque, the holiest site in Islam, and in fact captured Mecca for almost 2 weeks. Now, why is this important? It's important for what happened afterwards. The king identified who the clerics were that had blessed this operation against his family, against his monarchy. I know your relationship to the jihadists, and I know that you actually blessed their assault against Mecca and against me. If you guarantee for me that Saudi Arabia and my family will never ever be endangered by jihadi ideology ever again, you can become the royal ulema, the clerics to the House of Saud. You are permitted and even encouraged to disseminate this ideology around the world. And that links straight to September the 11th, that we suddenly have a institutional support for a fundamentalist ideological interpretation of jihad. And you make certain bargains with Saudi Arabia and other countries that on the long term actually undermine the safety of this country. Or we could simply unleash the incredible intellectual might of this country to find other sources of power, which within the next 15 years could make Saudi Arabia irrelevant to America in terms of energy access.
So that is Sebastian Gorka. And when I interviewed him, I was absolutely blown away by his knowledge because I didn't know who he was. I just reached out to Defensive Democracies because my partner, who's very powerful, had influence there because they were the original funders of that outfit, and they're on K Street, and they're very influential, particularly as their relationship with Israel. And you know, this guy calls me back and he says, "I'm willing to be interviewed by you." And this is 2011. Okay, when I interviewed him, the end of 2011, right before 2012. We didn't release 413 until 2013, but I started having this conversation with him, and I was really struck by his presence, and I was struck by his intellect and his delivery, and I was like, wow, this guy is exactly who I'm looking for. And that was the information that I had been pondering, because again, I was looking at Ford 13 as 911 Ford, quite frankly, and not ultimately what I would find out in the con, even though they're all inextricably mixed. So when we got that information about Saudi Arabia's involvement, there was other information that I had to have on the cutting room floor, where he made a quick turn to some very peculiar statements that I found very alarming at the time. And as I recall, I had engaged with him because he made this pivot from democracies to a certain authoritarianism as it relates to Israel in response to what was going on. And I was like, wait a second, that's kind of contradictory to all of the stuff that we were talking about. And anyway, we got what we had. We had a short amount of time, and that's what it was. But eventually, Gorka, as now many of you know, were very involved with the Trump administration. Now, at the time, I didn't know where he'd come from, and I'd found out later, and I want to get this right. I think he was working in Hungary, and I think he was involved with Viktor Orban's administration. And he's probably been one of those guys that have been involved a long time. Now, at the moment, as far as I know, he is the director of Donald Trump's, I guess we call him the terrorism czar. I know he went through an up and down with Trump back in the first administration, but I can just tell you from Stephen Miller and all of the things that were happening during the No Kings rally, and this peculiarity of branding, the folks that were engaged in No Kings, they were branded by the Trump administration as Antifa, and they're terrorists, right? Anybody who's anti-fascist is terrorist. Now, of course, anybody who understands America and our fight against the Nazis in World War II knows that our entire country is anti-fascist, right? Or at least it was, unless you've got the corridors of power and billionaires behind the scenes to create the situation of which we're all in the midst of which I've levied before. Corruption burns and fuels fascism, and here we are in this authoritarian state. All things ICE in the midst of all things Epstein, and yada, yada, yada. And Donald Trump, looting over $1 billion and nobody being able to stop him because the Supreme Court is captured, and so on and so forth. Everything that's now is a result of everything that I'm telling you, right? But I wanted to show you the Sebastian Gorka piece because, it's just amazing how things are evolving. But when there's a famous picture that I saw, I don't know, several years ago, and it really scratched my head. I scratched my head when I saw it, but it was Vladimir Putin and Mohammed bin Salman laughing as if they had some information that seems to me foreshadowing of everything we're in the midst of, to be quite frank with you. And in addition to all things Saudi, I don't even want to go into the whole thing about 9/11 and everything since, but at least we forget UAE and Qatar, but also Saudi have provided billions of dollars to their sovereign wealth fund to none other than Jared Kushner and former Secretary of the Treasury who came out of Goldman Sachs, Steve Mnuchin, that are all part of this. And I'll never forget this picture that I saw during the shutdown of the first, in the government shutdown in the first Trump administration, when Steve Mnuchin had to be flown from DC to Los Angeles, I think during the Super Bowl, on none other than Michael Milken's private jet. And again, Michael Milken, the mother of all RICO, going back to junk bonds, and his company, which was the largest player in this, whose name eludes me, but they were all involved with all this stuff in Atlantic City and all things Donald Trump. And this guy Zev Shalev makes the claim that the Russians were involved with that deeply, and that may or may not be completely true, or not sure, but it's certainly compelling nevertheless. So to finish all of this stuff off, right? So when I was talking about Saudi, and when I was creating the whole composite of Forward 13, waking up the American dream, what I saw, because I came from Texas, and I've mentioned this many times before, I understand the fossil fuel paradigm. I understand financialization. I understand everything that we've done through deregulation going back to the 80s. I understand where the power matrix is and what the military industrial complex is all about. And that's how I created the whole mechanism of Forward 13 to establish that we have to create the fourth industrial revolution. Now, that was 13 years ago. Now, we're in the midst of this double down by the Trump administration, as we've seen all thing Epstein, which is now relevant, even though it happened over 20 years ago. And then ultimately, as all of this stuff is happening with this just every day of flood the zone, misinformation, disinformation, all of the different variables that have just got America lost in translation, in addition to everything that they haven't revealed based on what I've revealed to you today, the nature and the magnitude of the revelations that have taken place just last week, that the Trump administration has been, and all of its affiliates within these billionaire apparatus, particularly as it relates to the Heritage Foundation, but the EPA has basically proclaimed that all environmental regulation has now been defeated. All of the lessons that we've learned for the last 30 years, 40 years of progress to a renewable energy paradigm ultimately has now been the death nail. Because when you understand the global reserve currency going back to 71, you understand that it's tied to oil, which is the commodity that replaced gold, that ultimately created this exorbitant privilege of the United States of the world's reserve currency that is now being attacked by, ironically, all of the nations, that are basically fossil fuel oriented primarily. That were created by Goldman, by the way. Goldman Sachs created what I'm trying to reveal, and I've gone through this whole thing in my mind so cloudy with so much information. It's so easy. My God, it's China, India, Saudi Arabia, Russia. So what is the amalgamation? And I guess South Africa is, and Brazil. BRICS. I just did Wheel of Fortune, and I was working it out as I was saying it. Oh my God, this is the nuttiest truth bomb I've ever done. But anyway, it's the most truthful. It has all of this information that starts with, of course, Catherine, Brummer, and I'll have to look at her name before I go out of it because I can't think of her name now. That ties this all together between Goldman Sachs and, of course, the Obama administration and all things Epstein that are the zeitgeist of everything that I've told you. So we provided tens of trillions of dollars illegally to the grifters, the racketeers that made it inevitable that we would get a Trump scenario that has completely destroyed the law, created common sense, destroyed everything in this vacuum of lies that nobody can disseminate, and everybody's going to look at different pieces. Here I'm giving you the macro and the entire story because I know corruption burns and fuels fascism, but I'm also of the mind that we're at the most glorious opportunity in the history of the world. If tens of millions of you can look back at this, study this, understand this, share this, get everybody else involved, to get involved with the Clean New Deal. Because we've got all of the answers. I've got literally all of the answers to turn the tables on this because the Democrats can't do it. They're hedged. They're all tied to the billionaire Epstein class as personified by the general counsel of Goldman Sachs that was formerly in the administration of Obama. There's no coincidence here. It's all the exact same story. And again, Obama promised he was riding it on a white horse, and I voted for him twice, and I believed in him, and I still believe he's a good guy, but he was picked for a reason, and I've got even so much more information that I can even think about. But he is not like Lawrence O'Donnell bequeathed last night. He is, so much more polish, and he's a genuinely presidential character in comparison to all things Donald Trump. And of course, Donald Trump revealed this just grotesque, fake AI of the Obamas as monkeys. And it was horrible, but it gives this situation where it's like Obama comes off as a statesman, right? And he's like, most Americans aren't racist. And I believe he's right. And I'm one of them. But Obama didn't change the situation. He didn't take the mandate of the American people to create an FDR moment. He put everybody back in control who created the carnage that then bailed themselves out to protect the investment class and all of these, international actors that have just destroyed the United States. We've been in the midst of financial terrorism for now decades that have led to the disparity of wealth, the affordability crisis, of which AOC can't discuss. She doesn't even know what racketeering is. Zoran Mandani is like 30 years old. I've probably been talking for 30 years here, but I'm certainly talking about things that have taken place over his entire lifetime that he's not aware of, that I've been in the trenches of for at least the last 16 years, because I'm Patrick level with the $71 trillion truth, right? So what are we going to do? It's the end of the world. It's biblical. It's prophecy. It's Armageddon. It's all of these things. Why? Because if you understand, I'm not a religious person, but it's ironic that the idea is that the world is going to be engulfed in evil and lies. Are we not? And then, of course, there's going to become this moment in the way it's laid out in Armageddon or in whatever these religious fanatics and the Christian evangelicals believe, that it's like, and this goes back to Israel, right? And that connection between evangelicals and what has now become this right-wing, corrupt, insane apparatus of the Netanyahu administration playing roulette with the truth, which is really what this is all about. And like Jon Snow says, and I always say that when people just use more and more lies, all you get is better and better lies, and words stop meaning anything. It has to come down to character and integrity, which I've always said. There's two columns of our soul. On one side, you've got character, integrity, decency, and dignity. And the other side is hypocrisy, duplicity, complicity. That's the freaking eternal struggle between light and dark, right? I swear to God, that's the greatest trick the devil ever played, was to convince the world he didn't exist. And I got tired of them pissing on my head telling me it was rain. And that's how I got the $71 trillion truth that leads to the ability in this remarkable time, this incredible opportunity. It's the greatest opportunity of our lifetimes to turn the table on this madness, to purge the misery of tyranny, to unleash the renaissance of possibility. When you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in dignity, equality, sustainability, beauty, liberty, and justice for all, when we merge in unity behind the Clean New Deal, when you become a nuclear reaction vector to the Big Bang of truth that I'm dropping, to drop light into the darkness, force light into the darkness, because as we know, both from the Bible, let there be light, okay? That's one side of the equation. But for those of you like me who are like, yeah, whatever, but it's kind of funny given the cosmology of the Big Bang, because what was the Big Bang? Let there be light, which came from none other than this incredible fusion of energy to blast light into the universe, right? Creation, which is what we think of in terms of the best physicists and knowledge known to man at this time period because of just science, quite frankly, right? But the analogy is apt because of what I'm telling you, because this murderous, thuggish pedophilia ring of Epstein, tyranny of the Epstein class has done all of these things that I've demonstrated, and now probably going on 2 hours, of this immense, unbelievable carnage of lies and deception from the system that, like that victim of Epstein said, I feel like I'm being raped by the system, because we all have been, except for those who are on top of this whole thing, okay? And so how are we going to fix it? Now I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to close this up. So Thank you to all of you who've stayed into this. I can't believe I do this stuff, but I do it because I have to. So the final piece of the puzzle is the Clean New Deal. We don't live in a democracy. We don't function as a capitalist system. We don't have free markets. The law is unequal. We don't have separation of powers. Corruption rules everything. Millions are beginning to understand the threat of Project 2025. The Clean New Deal is democracy's answer. Guys, I could even tell you more about how I know this is destiny, because destiny is what you do, the result of what you do on a daily basis. I've been doing this for now 751 truth bombs. I did the con before, Forward 13 before that, and then the 21 hours of the Pecora files, the new Untouchable, the new Pecora files, which has all of this information that the entirety of media has hid. And this is what the Epstein files leads to. And everything is on the line because they're going backwards to destroy a woman's right to choose. They're destroying the progressive civil rights movement that got us equality. They're going back, into the Jim Crow era. They're going back into authoritarianism, and it's all predicated on stolen money for destroying the middle class and the truth and the hope and the aspirations of what this whole American dream is about: dynamism. We have millions of people that are incredibly genius, that have answers, that know how to put these things together. But we've got to emerge in unity by the millions to be able to champion the Clean New Deal and push it up to the top of Everest, this boulder of truth, to the top of Everest, to go over the side, to become this bowling ball of truth, to wipe out the penheads of lies. Okay, maybe a silly reference to metaphor to end off with, but just finally, if you look at the white papers, you go to Federal Reserve Act 13.3. All of this information is there. The details are there. If you're a journalist, it's there. If you're somebody who just wants to ask questions and read, it's there. All of it is there. Same with the prosecutor versus the felon. It's what Harris didn't do and Merrick Garland didn't do when they had the information. And I didn't even mention Epstein, to be quite frank with you, not to mention the betrayal of the judiciary as it relates to the lies that they were able to manifest, the complete carnage of destroying tens of millions of people while at the same time saving the guys that did it to us. And ultimately, the precepts of the Clean New Deal is what you've got to understand. There are 4 questions, just like the 4 questions of Passover. What is qualified immunity? Should the police or ICE be able to murder with impunity? No. What is judicial immunity? Should the Supreme Court be above the law themselves to basically betray the American experiment? No. Should we have presidential immunity for the biggest fraud and corrupt, perverse pedo RICO in chief in the history of the world? Of course not. It's so obvious, it's unbelievable. How do they do it? The Electoral College is a tool to where the minority can rule the majority because of the tricks and fraud and all sorts of manner, shape, or form of documentation fraud and falsification that this whole system is baked on. When you put the whole thing together, you have the Rubik's Cube of the truth, and that's the eureka. When millions of us understand that, we got to create, number one here in the precept, create a modern day Glass-Steagall Act so that we separate commercial banking and investment banking, but we recreate the statutes to say that you can't use the full faith and credit of the United States under exigent circumstances to bail out racketeering. That's insane. That's what we did. That's what we've been doing. That's the $71 trillion truth. We've got to end Citizens United. That's just basically legalized corruption. Nothing good happens in the shadows. We need transparency. We're going to demonstrate how $71 trillion was used to be able to create the Epstein Class to destroy us all, and that asking where are we going to find the money isn't the question. It's why are we giving money to people that are destroying us, particularly in light at the end of the world, given all of the science that we understand about climate change. It's not a rhetorical question. It's just straightforward. It's not rocket science. It's racketeering. You want Medicare for all. You want to end systemic racism in prisons. You want a renewable energy paradigm. They're all possible. but we've got to root out corruption, root and stem first before we can get there. How? We've got to expand SCOTUS to 13 justices to overrun the Roberts Court. We've got to end qualified immunity. We got to end judicial immunity. We got to end presidential immunity. We got to end the Electoral College. We got to institute term limits for U.S. senators and representatives to prevent tyranny. And we got to prohibit all insider trading for everybody in Congress to basically sell us out so they can get rich in the process. I don't know how long I've been going for. I don't know what's going to happen from this one. I've said this 750 times. This is the 751st time that I've done it. I could do it more effectively if I had, the resources to do it in increments and everything else. But then that would be tough too, because ultimately we're also inundated with so much stuff. I mean, I open my phone every day and I see a million things that take my focus to 50 gazillion different things to where I can't, think about this stuff. That's why I had to lay it all out. Again, this isn't about me. I'm not nothing special. I'm just some dude who has the tenacity and the wherewithal to be able to put deals together. That's why I'm a producer. That's what I've been doing for a very long time. I know how to operate as somebody with, shall we say, objectives, and I know how to make things happen. But all of this stuff is coming at us so fast and furious that unless I put this together, nobody else will. And starting with what I started with today, this revelation of all things, the Attorney General of Goldman Sachs that just passed down, that was part of the Obama administration, and her involvement with Epstein, it's the last piece of the puzzle to prove everything. Challenge me. If you're an economist, challenge me. If you're a legal expert, challenge me. If you're somebody who, is super hyper-focused on the Epstein files and you don't get it, ask me questions. More importantly, we've got to get this information to everybody who's interested in running for the midterms. We've got to create a national movement behind the Clean New Deal to make all of this crystal clear. Because again, all we have to do is just basically recontextualize the law. We have to really do, and this is, I guess, my closing thought. We're nearing the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, where the founding fathers and everybody involved were able to do successfully what nobody in history had done before, and that was to break the grip of tyranny of King George III, of course, the East India Trading Company. That was the entirety of the Boston Tea Party, the Royal Navy, and the Redcoats. We are England. We are England of that time period. Yeah, and that's why I made Ford 13, Waking Up the American Dream, as a sort of respect on this journey, because I could go into 13 and I don't want to, but 13 is the number of revolution. 13 is the number of, as it turns out, universal truth, or I should say balance in the universe. These are all weird things that I've come across. I've been on this journey literally 13 years. The time is now for us all to come together, because this is a revolution of truth and justice and liberty for all. I can't believe you're still here. There's hope if you are. Please like, subscribe, and share. Don't be afraid to reach out. We can do this together, but only if millions of us can get through this dystopia and this matrix of lies to get to the core of the truth. It's just simply the Epstein class has considered you expendable. And I know I'm not expendable, and chances are you're not either. Onwards and upwards.